All right, good evening, everybody. Today we're here to announce murder charges against defendant Sandra, and the last name I'll spell. It's Kolalou. I know I talked about this, no problem. We talked about this case briefly yesterday, but on the 10th of October at approximately 6 or 7 p.m., officers were called to the address of 5919 North Washtenaw regarding a missing person, female, white, 69 years of age. And things unfolded very quickly when the officers arrived on the scene. The timeline is a little bit sketchy because so many different things happened at the same time. But tenants who live inside this residence with the victim had not seen the victim in a day, and they were concerned for her safety because one of the other tenants who I mentioned, the defendant, Sandra, who's charged with murder, many of the tenants who lived in this house were afraid of this individual. There were several calls. We look back, 911 calls regarding tenants and this defendant that was just charged. Tenants inside the residence, they heard a screaming at about 2:30 in the morning Monday night, and that's when the next day at about, like I said, 6 or 7 p.m., they called to report the victim missing because the other tenants couldn't get a hold of the victim. When officers arrived on the scene, the defendant was still on the scene and actually exiting the residence, going to a tow truck, which she had actually ordered using the victim's credit card. Officers attempted to interview her on the scene because the other tenants had mentioned that, we believe something's wrong. We can't locate the missing person, the person who actually owns the house, the victim. That individual, the defendant at that time, said that she knew her rights, didn't want to talk to the police, entered the tow truck and asked the tow truck driver to drive her to Foster Beach where her car was to tow her car. The tenants were afraid for the tow truck driver as well, so they exchanged information with the tow truck driver explaining that they thought this individual was dangerous. The tow truck driver communicated with the tenants and explained when he got to Foster Beach that this individual had placed a large bag in a garbage can. Some of the tenants actually followed the tow truck over there, and they saw that there were some bloody rags in this garbage can, at which point, like I said, the police were already on the scene back at the house, but they notified the police, and then additional police officers went to this scene where they noticed the bloody rags. And when officers were originally on the scene with the tenants who lived inside the house, who reported the individual missing, they couldn't find any signs of, blood or foul play. But once they found the bloody rags, the tenants and the police went in, and they were able to find some additional blood inside the tenant's room, at which point they discovered the gruesome remains in a freezer. At that point, like I said, all these things are kind of happening at the same time. And I just want to thank the police officers and obviously the tenants who live in this place for coming forward and their cooperation with the police. The defendant at that time was still with the tow truck driver, and it actually had threatened the tow truck driver with a knife. Due to the communication between the tow truck driver and the tenants, officers were able to get to that scene immediately and place the defendant in custody for pulling a knife on the tow truck driver. The defendant was then brought back to Area 3 Detective Division, where she immediately invoked her right to remain silent, and she has not had an interview with any police officers. She continued to invoke her right to remain silent. As I mentioned, after they discovered these gruesome remains, the detectives left the residence, secured a search warrant, and went back, and then that search warrant has revealed additional blood the detectives have found inside the victim's bedroom. They found blood on some knives inside the residence, and then unfortunately discovered, like I said, the gruesome remains in a freezer. At that point, the detectives, as I mentioned, the garbage can was taken down to the medical examiner's office, and there were bloody rags and linens found in that garbage can. Detectives continued to investigate this crime all day and worked with the cooperation of the other tenants who resided in this residence, who fully cooperated with the police. And then just shortly ago, working with the state's attorney's office throughout the night and throughout the day, were able to secure charges of first-degree murder against the offender and concealment of a homicide. I could take some questions. I know that a lot unfolded at the same time, so I understand there might be some questions regarding the timeline, but I'll do my best to answer any questions you guys have. And real quick, once again, I just want to thank the detectives and the officers involved. The 20th District officers did a remarkable job trying to coordinate with the tenants in the house. And the detectives obviously have worked through the night the last 40 hours or so. So I want to thank everybody who cooperated in order to get this dangerous offender off the street.
Jermont Terry with CBS 2. I have two questions for you. You mentioned that, there were calls to 911. Were those recent calls, and how far back do they date?
Yeah, so I actually was talking to the detectives about that. So they, during the course of their investigation trying to charge this offender, they went back and just saw where their 911 calls for their residents. So I don't have the exact answer, how far they went back or the details of the calls. That's still something that they're looking into.
Were those calls all related to the suspect that you have charged today?
I don't have that answer. So that's just part of, they just wanted to see if there were calls to the residents. It appears that some of those calls were related to these tenants being afraid of this one tenant, but I don't have the details on all those calls.
Neighbors or tenants in the apartments that they heard screams 2 a.m. Monday night into Tuesday morning. Where do you believe the crime actually took place? And do you believe the dismemberment of the body actually happened in the home?
So we have to speculate a little bit here, which we obviously don't like to do, but based upon the totality of the evidence, the detectives believe the crime actually occurred in the victim's bedroom, and then they do believe that the dismemberment took place on the first floor of that residence.
And how?
That part, without the defendant talking, it appears it possibly could have been done with large butcher knives.
Questions for you as well. Also related to the 911 calls, was Sandra ever arrested?
She does have a previous criminal history for some misdemeanor offenses. It doesn't appear, but like I said, we still have to go backwards on all these 911 calls to see if she was ever placed in custody for any of the calls that came through. So I don't have the answer to those specific calls, but she does have a criminal history for some misdemeanor offenses.
And then also going back to I'm just curious, how was she able to other tenants? Someone else was able to find her body before police did in this freezer?
So, and I don't want to get too detailed into this, but the way the residence was set up is there were a couple of apartments on the top floor, I'll call it the second floor, and then on the floor where the victim lived, that is the same floor that Sandra resided on as well. And then there was a tenant in the basement, and there were deadbolts, so people had privacy. So that's why. So the residents were, they were very cooperative. When they heard the scream, when they woke up in the morning, they immediately started texting the victim saying, "Are you okay?" Started calling the victim. The victim didn't answer. There were some texts that were sent back from the victim's phone. It appears from what we know now that the defendant was sending texts from the victim's phone and not answering it. But yeah, so these tenants, they heard a scream. They didn't know if something was wrong due to the fact that there had been arguments before with this defendant and other people in the residence. The tenants immediately in the morning started to, try to figure out what was wrong. And as the day as they went through the day and they were not able to get a hold of the victim and the victim wasn't responding, they kept feeling more and more was wrong. But they didn't just have free reign of the house, if you understand. They couldn't just go downstairs and look. And when they did, when the tenants were able to do that, in the beginning, they didn't discover any blood, but they knew something was wrong. And that's why finally at 6 o'clock, they're like, something is definitely wrong here, and let's get the police involved. And I truly want to thank those tenants for their tenacity on realizing that, something is definitely wrong, which led to the arrest. So I do want to thank them that, unfortunately they had to be part of this.
Anthony Ponce with Fox 32. Just another couple questions for me. First, you mentioned these 911 calls in the past and that these tenants were afraid of the suspect here. Can you provide any insight into why they were afraid, and also any insight into a motive or a possible motive here, if this was an ongoing thing, just tension between these two, or possibly some sort of landlord-tenant issue?
So for the possible motive, like obviously we mentioned, the defendant invoked her right to remain silent, but for the possible motive, kind of going backwards to the other tenants being a little bit afraid based upon some aggressiveness with this one defendant. So based upon all that, the deceased, the person who owns the residence, had actually served the defendant with like a notice to leave or an eviction notice. And that was done very recently. I don't want to get the day wrong, but I think it might have even been done as recently as of Saturday. So due to that service, that very well could possibly be which escalated this into the defendant becoming extremely angry and committing this horrific act. I'll give you that offline because I don't know the exact pronunciation, so I will call the officers and get the exact one so I don't get it wrong on air here. All right, thank you.